The second part of our notes for ecology has to do with communities. The question that I would like you to think about between now and the end is feral cat populations can be damaging to ecosystems. Why? Let's quickly define community again. It's an assemblage of all the populations that are interacting with one another. So squirrel, moose, bear, fox, wolf, pine tree, termites, bacteria, all of those being an example of a community. A few more definitions to get under our belt. One is habitat. That's the particular place that an organism lives. The ecological niche or niche is the role it plays in the community. That includes food sources, reproduction, and placement. The fundamental niche is all of the conditions that an organism needs to survive, all the conditions, all of the places that an organism can survive. And the realized niche is where it actually exists in nature. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So going a little bit further on a niche, each member of a community here is gathering its food in a unique way. This is allowing them all to live in generally the same community, but not compete directly for food sources. So you have a flamingo, and it's feeding on small mollusks and crustaceans. You've got ducks, and they swim down and they eat small aquatic plants, seeds, snails, and insects. You've got other types of birds that feed on insects and small marine animals, and they do this in a particular way by sweeping their beaks from side to side in shallow water. Oyster catchers that pry open shells with their beaks. And then you've also got other types of birds that actually spend more time on land eating the insects there. So this is an example of each individual organism or species obtaining food in the same community but in different ways. Going back to the idea of realized versus fundamental niche, remember that a fundamental niche is the full range of conditions, and this includes both biotic and abiotic conditions, and also the resources where a particular species could survive and reproduce. This would be an environment with no predators and no competitions, and that is really not common or actually found in the environment. The realized niche takes into account the interspecific competition. This would be different species that all want the same resources, and also the intra-specific competition. Those are within the same species. The realized niche is everything. It has been calculated. Once all of these factors are come into play, where does the organism actually exist? So again, you've got interspecific competition. That's between different species. There's also intra-specific competition. That would be between same species. From this comes the idea of the competitive exclusion principle, which says no two species can occupy the same niche. And what happens is there tends to be some type of resource partitioning where if there is some type of niche overlap, they actually share or partition these resources. And the classic example here is with the balanus and the thalamus barnacles. There's a guy named Connell, and he studied two different species of barnacles. The balanus is mostly found in the lower intertidal zones, where the thalamus is found in the upper part of the intertidal zones. And he was really interested as to why these two species did not grow together. So he did a couple of experiments. In one situation, he removed the thalamus from the upper intertidal zones. And once he did that, he noticed that none of the balanus came in to replace them on the upper tidal zone. This would be due to the fact that the balanus are actually much more susceptible to drying out. The scientific term for that is desiccation. So the balanus niche is the same as its fundamental niche, meaning it only exists in the lower tidal zones. When given the opportunity to move up into the intertidal zones, it didn't. So it didn't seem that there was any difference between its realized niche, where it's actually living, and the fundamental, where it could live. In the second case, the Connell removed the balanus from the lower intertidal zones, and he found that the thalamus would readily replace the removed species. So he inferred that the balanus must be better competitor at the lower intertidal zones, but that the fundamental niche of the thalamus was different than its realized niche in this case. Again, that's because its realized niche where it's actually living in the intertidal, upper intertidal zones. When given a chance to live in the lower intertidal zones, it did. Another example of the competitive exclusion principle and resource partitioning can be found with different species of birds. So here we're looking at 3 different bird species, and they have each slightly different beak depths. And if you look at the first one, they coexist on several different islands. And the first graph is just showing the percent of animals that live that have different beak depths, and they've classified them as small, medium, and large. And then they looked at one of these animals, one of these birds that lived only on one particular island, and found that was mostly small to medium beak length. Whereas, okay, so I misspoke a little bit on that one. What I was trying to say is that we have 3 different species of birds illustrated by the blue, orange, and red color. And what you can see is when they all have to coexist on the same island, each of them have a different type of beak depth so that they can eat a different type of insect. But when these birds are not having to coexist on the same island, they actually have a different beak depth. That's an example of resource partitioning. Another example of competitive exclusion can be found with many different species of birds. With birds, they tend to inhabit particular parts of trees. So you've got up top, a little bit lower, etc., etc. And that's an example of competitive exclusion. Another thing that is involved with community ecology is predator-prey interactions. So these are common interactions that are found in different communities. As prey increases in number, then predator numbers will increase as the prey species decline, and so does the predator, and this cycle repeats. Here's an example. So you look at the prey population. As prey population increases, so does predator population, which then causes the prey population to decrease, and then the predator population will follow, and that repeats. You've seen this before. This is another example of the hare and lynx doing the exact same thing. One goes up, the other goes up, then one goes down, and the other goes down. Another thing to be considered about when you're thinking about prey-predator reactions is defenses that prey exhibit. One of them is camouflage. Another name for camouflage is cryptic coloration. That's basically blending in. Or you can have mimicry, and that's when you have one species that is actually resembling another species. Typically, the species they're resembling is one that is poisonous or does not taste good. There are different types of mimicry, and it looks like this got cut off, so I'll fix that on the slide that I post. You can have Batesian mimicry, that's fooling. That's when you have one organism resembling in appearance of another organism that does not taste good. So you have a particular type of butterfly that actually tastes good, and it will resemble a particular type of butterfly that does not taste good. That's Batesian mimicry. You can also have Mullerian mimicry. That's a warning, and that's when you have one species that resembles another species that are avoided by predators to a greater degree than it would be alone. So let me show you an example of that because I totally butchered that explanation. The monarch and viceroy butterfly are an example of Batesian mimicry. The monarch butterfly actually tastes disgusting, and the viceroy does not, but a lot of times predators cannot tell the difference between the two, so they avoid the viceroy because it looks like the monarch. In Mullerian mimicry, the idea is all of these organisms are dangerous in that they can all sting, so they all resemble each other. And what happens is that allows, once a predator has had experience with one of these organisms, here we have different types of insects that look like bees, once a predator has experience with one of them, it will know to avoid all of them. So that's Mullerian mimicry. There are other types of defenses that animals use for defense against predators. One of them is herding behavior, so that's in zebras. Especially the zebras use their coloration also to help confuse the predators. but in general, when you have large numbers of organisms together, predators have a hard time coming in. You can have startle behavior like the blowfish, so the blowfish will expand rapidly and scare a predator off. You can have anatomical defenses like the porcupine. You get too close, you're going to get those pines stuck in you. They're not called pines, but whatever they're called. Also chemical defense like the skunk, and unfortunately we're all pretty familiar with that. Another type of defense is a warning coloration. This is a bold, distinctive pattern of color that's characteristic of a poisonous or unpalatable, which means does not taste good, organism. It functions as a warning to predators. You can also have false eye spots, which are awesome. When a predator sees them, they'll mistake it for a much bigger organism than actually is there. This is an organism here that actually has a false head. So you can see the false head up top. So this one, if bitten on its false head, will still be okay. Community development also involves the concepts of succession. Ecological succession is a series of species replacement, and there's various different types. You can have primary succession, and that's going to occur when there's no soil. So if there's been a volcano and all the soil is wiped out, primary succession will be the type of succession that occurs over time. Secondary succession will occur after an area is disturbed. So this is typically fire. There would still be soil there. Pioneer species is the name given to the first species to inhabit an area. And a climax community is when the species replacement has slowed and the ecosystem has stabilized. So here you have an example of an area that was hit by fire, and over time it will start to grow back. That process is succession. Another example, in the process of succession, you'll typically start with grasses, then low shrubs, higher shrubs, and then low trees and high trees. A pretty common question will come on tests. We'll ask why over the process of succession would you have a whole bunch of high trees but not a lot of like shrub trees or low trees? So think about that for a sec. The main answer is that the high trees will prevent the lower organisms from getting sun, so they replace them. Biodiversity is the last concept to talk about. One is the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. This is that if you have some type of disturbance in an ecosystem, that's necessary in order to maintain biodiversity. And there's a lot of examples of things that happen when you don't have disturbances. Keystone species are essential in order to maintain biodiversity. These are often the top predators. So an example that we're going to talk about with sea otters and sea urchins, we'll show you on the next slide here. So the keystone species is the sea otters. Sea otters eat sea urchins eat kelp. So what's going to happen when you remove the otters? Well, if you don't have otters, you're going to have a whole lot of sea urchins around. The sea urchins will then eat all the kelp that's around, and then they won't have any more food. So you need that keystone species to really maintain the biodiversity of the area. That is the end of the community part of the ecology lecture.